Alright, good afternoon, world history classes. As you may have already noticed, we're doing things a little bit differently this week. I unfortunately cannot be with you guys in person for this lesson this week. However, with everything being online anyways, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So before we get into today's lesson, I just wanted to go over a few things. As always, you guys feel free to reach out to either myself or Ms. Sullivan over email if you have anything to let us know. Even just letting us know how you're doing. If you need any extra support, questions on the assignments, we're always checking our emails, making sure that you guys are being supported right now. So don't forget, if you need to reach out to us, do not be afraid to. Second note, there is an accompanying Peardeck to go along with this video lesson today, because I do have some questions to go along with what we're going to talk about today. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. We've been talking about World War II for pretty much the last month. Now normally, we would have finished World War II a long time ago, and we would have moved on to more modern history, which to me is the most fascinating history out of all of the other histories, and probably the one that's most relevant to you, because modern history, anything coming after World War II, especially when we get into the Cold War in the 1960s and 70s, this is the stuff that your parents and your grandparents lived through. However, with COVID-19 and this pandemic, we've had to kind of slow our pace down a lot. Can you guys believe that we actually have 2 weeks left? It's pretty crazy. So obviously, I'm super disappointed that we didn't get to cover most of this modern history, but we gotta roll with the punches. Last week's assignment should have given you some idea of the stuff that we would have gone on to talk about for the rest of this semester. We could have talked about the Vietnam War, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the decolonization of Africa, the rise of some of the African dictators, independence movement in India, and the salt marches of Gandhi. All of this is stuff that we would have covered had things not been shaken up so much. And I cannot begin to encourage you guys enough to go out and find more about this stuff, because it really is what makes up the world that you live in today. Now, I may be biased because it's my literal job to teach history, but history really is for everybody. And history is really interesting, and I apologize if at any time this year I did not make it interesting for you. There's really no excuse for that. So I hope you guys got something good, some good stuff out of our class. But really, this class is just the tip of the iceberg for much longer, more colorful stories that you can be getting into with history. So I would be most happy to know that I at least inspired you to go and find out a little bit more about this stuff. For our last topic, we're going to talk about North Korea and the Korean War, which came right after World War II, and was one of the first conflicts of the Cold War, which, if we were in school normally, this would officially begin our Cold War unit. For some context on what the Cold War was and why is it called the Cold War. After World War II, Europe practically became divided between the communist East and the capitalist West. China also emerged from World War II, a communist country with revolutionary Mao Zedong as its new leader. China, along with the Soviet Union, committed to realizing a new communist world order. The two would develop some pretty big differences later on and end up kind of developing their own rivalry. Either way, Russia and the United States were set on beating each other in the game of becoming the dominant superpower. However, neither power really wanted to go into open war with one another, which is why it's called the Cold War, because it never turned into a hot war where the United States and the Soviet Union went into all-out war. That does not mean, though, that there were not wars and that there weren't violent conflicts. Korea is one of the examples. North Korea gets in the news a lot today, mostly because of this guy, Kim Jong-un, and his desire to develop nuclear weapons. This poses a concern for several nations, especially the United States and North Korea's neighbor, South Korea. So why does North Korea want to develop nuclear technology so badly? And why is the US so concerned about preventing them from developing this technology? And why is North and South Korea divided in the first place? To answer these questions, we have to study the Korean War. So let's talk about the Korean War.
First, a long-term memory question to ask you guys. Which aspiring imperialist country invaded Korea and fought and won wars against both China and Russia in the early 1900s? Feel free to pause the video to think about it for a sec. This goes with your Peardeck questions. If you guessed Japan, you are correct. Japan took control of the Korean peninsula from 1910 until the end of World War II. During this time, they tried to eradicate Korean culture and language, and they committed some pretty terrible atrocities and war crimes while they were in control there. Korea was heavily fought over during the war years, but after World War II, Japan was defeated, and the brand new United Nations, which if you remember from last week was created in 1945, decided to divide Korea at the 38th parallel, cutting the country in half. In the north, the Soviets had control, and in the south, the Americans had control. Things stayed like this until about 1950, when the situation boiled over, and North Korea invaded with 100,000 troops to try and reclaim the entirety of Korea. They were led by Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandpa. The US sent in troops and fought the North Koreans all the way back up to the Chinese border. However, China, which was communist now, remember, wasn't going to let this happen. So they actually sent in their own army disguised as Korean troops. Why did they do this? Well, remember, the world powers didn't actually want to start another world war, so they tried to keep conflicts contained, and they usually did this by, convincing the other side that they wasn't actually their troops who were fighting. So the US and its South Korean allies were forced to retreat. US General Douglas MacArthur wanted to drop nuclear bombs to end the war, but President Truman had decided that this had gone too far and he didn't want to drop more nuclear bombs and escalate things, leading to another world war. So the war ended in 1953, right where it began, at the 38th parallel. Ever since then, the DMZ, or what we call the demilitarized zone, has separated North Korea from South Korea. No one is allowed to cross it or even communicate through it. Millions and millions of landmines and hundreds of miles of barbed wire fence separate the two countries. The only spot where the two sides can communicate is here. And these guys, right here, are locked into an eternal staring contest. Seriously, these guards have been standing here watching each other pretty much non-stop since 1953. From then on, things haven't really changed. There have been some tense moments, but it has been a standstill up until today. And even though the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, nearly 30 years ago, the DMZ remains, and both the North and South stand ready at any moment to resume fighting. Trump did cross the DMZ in June of last year to meet Kim Jong-un, which was a pretty historic moment, but it's still anybody's guess what will happen in Korea. The situation is also complicated because the ruling family of North Korea, the Kims, have set themselves up as almost godlike figures to the North Korean people. People are required to put paintings of the Kims in their homes, and any trash talking of them will result in the secret police probably busting down your door. Does anyone remember what we call this godlike worship of political figures? Answer on your Peardeck. Right, we call this a cult of personality. So, North Korea wouldn't exist today if it weren't for the funding and support of the two big communist countries, Russia and China. And South Korea wouldn't exist if it weren't for the funding and support of the United States. Despite the end of the Cold War in the 1980s, parts of that Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill talked about still stand today. We saw this history play out in a similar way with the Vietnam War. Russia and China backed the North, while the US backed the South. However, that ended with the United States being driven out of the country, and Vietnam still calls itself a communist country even today. These are all proxy wars. Wars fought between groups or smaller countries that represent the interest of the larger superpowers that back them up. The United States and the West were afraid of communist ideology from spreading, so they backed governments that promised to keep the communists from taking over. This led to some pretty messy situations, and sometimes the United States even backed some pretty atrocious dictators, who tortured and killed thousands of their own people just to keep the communists from taking power. So, one of the big historical questions here is, was it all worth it? If the US didn't get involved in so many places around the world, maybe it wouldn't be the global superpower that it is today. And perhaps China or Russia would fulfill that role. So I want to know your opinion. This is our critical question. Should the US have been involved in other countries' politics? Should it continue to be involved in other countries' politics? Because it still has a pretty active role, even today. Pause the video and take some time to really think about this question and tell me what you think.
Alright, that wraps our short lesson for this week. A very, very condensed version of the Korean War and the overarching Cold War. Your assignment is to thoughtfully respond to the prompt that I just gave you over Peardeck. Should the United States have been involved in Korea, Vietnam, and its other proxy wars? Should it continue to influence foreign politics? Tell me why or why not. If you would like to learn more about these proxy wars and the Cold War in general, check out some of these videos up here in the corner. As always, don't be a stranger, you guys. Reach out to us if you need to. Take it easy. I look forward to seeing you guys next week for our last and final session. Can you believe it? All right. Take it easy.